So, I'm a lawyer from training, so excuse me if I take the legal approach to the ELSI issues. I just want to give you a sort of overview what we are discussing throughout Europe within BBMI, the Common Service ELSI. BBMI, I'm a member of the Common Service ELSI. I'm based in Berlin because BBMI is, as you might know, a distributed network, so we have experts all over Europe. And we are trying to build there some common standards, and as we have heard from our colleague from Bologna, it's all about standardizing, because biobanking exchange of biosamples and data depends on some standards, that you compare the quality, but also that you have a common legal and ethical basis to exchange. So let me first, do I have some, no, this way, yeah. So just to give you a general overview, so I've just listed some relevant fields of law here, just to show you that biobanking in ELSI respects is really a complex area. So you have to really observe very many rules around the exchange, the storage, the capture of data, the storage of samples, and exchange and use of samples. And even if you start with the law, you will end up with many questions that are not resolvable by just taking into account legal obligations. Many questions are open, and you have to take decisions on the basis of ethics. That's why ELSI is always ethical and legal discussion. So I leave just away the S of ELSI, that's societal issues, because I'm not an expert in it, so that's not my talk today. So let's just focus on legal and ethical aspects. So let's just try and have a look into the first, civil law. That seems to be very clear and simple, but yes, you can see even basic questions are not very simple, have no simple answers. So what about ownership of biomaterial? That would be a clear and very simple question if you start with animal material, because we buy and sell it every day. But as soon as you have human material, you have to raise the question, is there an ownership at all? So how do we transfer biomaterial? Who has something to say in it? Who has the control of the biomaterial? We had a huge discussion in Germany and in other European countries. And it's a very practical question, is who in the end has to determine what has, who can say how and who can use the material. So in the end we have decided, okay, there is an ownership in the sense of civil law, so you can own the material, but this ownership is limited. It has to be limited on ethical grounds and for ethical reasons. So the material is regarded, as we all know, as not just material like animal biosamples or just other material, but it contains, let's say, a part of our personality. It contains data, it contains sensitive data such as genetic data, and that's why we have the feeling that it's not just freely tradable. We have to set some limits, and the practical consequence is that if somebody withdraws his consent, a donor who has given consent to use his sample for research, and he withdraws consent, then this sample has to be deleted and not further used for research. And that's widely accepted, I think, in Europe and even globally. It sometimes hurts because as a researcher and as a biobank provider, you have invested money and time and effort to collect the samples, but we have to respect then the will of the donor and just destroy the samples. Another question with regard to civil law is what about the informed consent of minors, of children? So there has been a case in the UK, even decided by courts, where a 15-year-old, I think, girl has just opposed the decision of her parents to give the consent to use her samples and data for research, and the court decided that her will has to be respected. So in Germany we didn't have such cases, but we tend to have informed consent forms for children. That's not called really consent. It's not legally binding in the full sense of the law, but the will even of minors have to be taken into account before using samples and data for research. It's called assent of minors. And we have special consent forms for it, but yeah, I don't know if you have developed such things here in Turkey, in Istanbul, or wherever. So with many images on, so like explaining to children, to try to get across the information, what that means to give consent to such research use. So these are just two examples. Let's come to one of the, I'm sorry, I think it's not really very well readable. I'll try to explain it step by step. This is one of the really major fields of law concerned through biobanking and biomedical research beyond biobanking. That's privacy and data protection of donors and patients. That's really important, and as I've understood this, the question was a little bit in the direction of what do you do with my data in future, and I think this is really important. Health data are always sensitive data. They are sensitive data under the European law, but it's quite obvious that you can misuse these data in many ways to increase your insurance rates, to deny, to give you a certain job, to even make you a suspect in criminal investigations from, under certain conditions. So it's really sensitive data, and we have to obey certain rules there and with regard to the protection of the privacy of the patients and donors. So the bad news is there's no real harmonized data protection law around the world. What we have are some basic principles. We have some human rights catalogs. I've here just referred to the European Convention on Human Rights. So there's the most European countries are members there. Turkey is always also a member. So there's a right to respect for private and family life. That's one of the really main principles. But beyond that, you can hardly find really data protection legislation around the world. We have a fragmented system. We have some global soft law, some guidelines and recommendations. There's, for example, the very well-known World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki. This has been incorporated in German law. I guess it's in Turkey it should be the same. And there's now, I don't know if you've heard of it, the World Medical Association is just drafting a new declaration on ethical considerations regarding health databases and biobanks. So there has been a negotiation in Copenhagen last year, and it has shown that there are some very controversial points there, and there you can see that there's no standard around the world. There are some open issues we have to go on and with the debate and come to conclusions. I don't think that this declaration will be adopted this year, I don't know. And there's a Council of Europe recommendation on research on biological materials of human origin containing some data protection rules, but even this is to a certain extent controversial, and there's been a very new, this is quite new, and it has now been revised, and there are some points I personally would not agree. We can come later to this. And then we have within the EU, that's a little bit of a good news, at least now very strong basis for harmonizing data protection law within the European Union. We have a new regulation on this. The last version is of December. It's not adopted, but it's the result of the negotiations between all the involved bodies within the EU, and I think that will come within April of this year. So that's the basis. It's complex, it's complicated, and it's not really global. And even if you just go back to just the European Union law data protection, you end up with open questions there. So even the brand new regulation leaves many questions just open. And many important questions are, for example, what about human biomaterial? Is it data or does it just contain data? So, and linked to this question is, can you anonymize biomaterial? So if it's just material and not data, you could just delete all the metadata and then say, okay, it's anonymous samples. That's what many, many biobanks have done in the past. And that causes many problems, I tell you this. My personal view is that it is data. It's just not coded digitally, but you know, the DNA is in the sample and it's just to make it readable, but it's in. But the approaches are very different across Europe and globally. So in the United States, you always anonymize biosamples, so they have no problem with it. In Europe, there's a tendency not to anonymize because, and this is the second bullet point, what about genetic data? Either you have just very few data and then it's even not personal data because you cannot single out a person behind that data, or you have enough data to single out a person and then it's a really risky, highly identifying data set. So can you anonymize genetic data? I would be reluctant to do it, but we have no clear position on this. Even within BBMI, we're discussing it, but there's no clear position. From the perspective of research, I would say in Germany we don't anonymize at all because it hinders follow-up data capture and enriching as we have heard in Bologna, they try to capture as much data they can around a data set. So it's useful for research. If you anonymize a biosample, there's no data around. So you just have the material, you can then sequence it, but that's it. So what we do is pseudonymize biosamples and genetic data. So we try to de-identify it so that not everybody has the full identity and can see who is the owner of the sample and the data. But that you can retrace the donor and that you can do follow-up research with the samples and the genetic data. So a completely open question is, how are the relatives of donors affected by genetic sequencing? This is completely unresolved. Nobody even dares to touch the question from a legal point of view because it's clear that my close relatives share genetic data with me. So if I give consent to use it for research, what about my relatives, my parents, my children? Nobody knows. So if you have ideas, please. And a very important question is, what about informed consent? So data protection law requires that you have to give specific consent. What does that mean? What is specific? How broad can consent be? So if we want to use samples and genetic data for databases, for open research purposes, we have to have a sort of broad consent. We cannot go back for every single analysis to the donor to ask, oh, would you, and he wouldn't want us to do it. Many patients say, please leave me alone. I've given you the consent. Please use my data for research. I'm fine with it, but don't come back to me every 2 weeks. So that's impossible. So there's an, let's say, evolving standard in Europe and even under the data protection law in the EU now. There's a little recital. So I've in person lobbied for it a little bit, that broad consent can be collected for such research resources where you really are not able to predict the future research purpose. But that's a crucial question. And on the other hand, you have, if you collect such broad consent, you have to assure patients and donors that you really keep the data within a certain control. So times of open access to genetic databases are really over. So there's Sanger Institute has changed. Everybody who has done it in the past has changed policy. You have controlled access everywhere. And that's really a requirement to have some safeguards around and to make sure that there's no misuse of these genetic data. So whenever you like, you can interrupt me and ask questions. That's clear? It's just another field. I'm just going through my list and just pointing to some points. Yeah.
So far, we have been talking about these rules applying to the only research, not at therapeutic use. Because at the beginning, we classified the two areas, one of them therapeutic use, then one research area.
Yeah.
So these laws is valid for the research area. Am I right?
In principle, they are just general rules, so everybody has to comply. But, and this is a sort of a privilege, it's under German law and it's under, I think, all legislations, that physicians have to observe their obligations under their professional law, and they have a professional secrecy, really an obligation to keep all the information they have secret. So they have to have the information, they have to have the full identity. I mean, if you're a patient, your doctor knows you and knows your data and has to know all your data. That's a privilege. On the other hand, you have even the right to not to be obligated to witness in court and to say something about your patient. So you are protected against seizure of your data and against accusing your patients before court. So that's the whole system. So within the context of health care, you have these body of rules of professional secrecy, but as soon as the data leaves this healthcare context, the hospital or the healthcare, the physician, let's say, control, then like in a biobank, the biobank normally is established for further research. Then you have to follow just the data protection rules and the ethical principles around. But you know, there's a linkage because the biomaterial always comes from that healthcare context. Not always, but we have these population biobanks where just normal people without being patients come and donate. But very often the material comes from the healthcare context. So these rules are still a little bit the basis of the treatment afterwards. You know, patients trust the doctor, and patients want to have a similar, let's say, control of their data and samples. So it's not that they give in the healthcare context, they give away their sample and data, and then afterwards the biobank does what it wants. So it's a sort of an interrelation, and I think we have to keep that in mind. I had really a few discussions with people from Elixir. I don't know if you know Elixir. That's the other research network, just my Italian colleague has just mentioned, and they are quite far away from the source and origin of the data. So they sometimes lose the feeling that these data, genetic data, health data, come from that very sensitive area and from patients. So that's always important to remind researchers that they have a certain responsibility. It's not this professional law, but it's a certain obligation not to forget that it's a very special area around these health data. So I've just mentioned that declaration. I think you all might know it. So that's just to make a pause for a moment and see why do we have this? Why do we need the trust of the patients? It's not only about ethics. For research, I mean, we've just discussed it yesterday evening. Recruitment rates are not always as high as we would wish in research. So to have really valuable results, you need to have a statistical significant group of people there. So if you want to run a clinical trial, you know you have to have a protocol and you have to have enough patients. So when it comes to rare diseases or cancer patients, especially children cancer patients, recruitment rates are really high, up to 90%. But for other diseases and to get samples of healthy people, just of population biobanks, recruitment rates are too low in our view in Germany and in many other countries. So to build up a really trustworthy environment is crucial to get enough samples and valuable data to come to really significant results. And it has to be, we have to show people. We don't have to do it, but we have to show people, look, your data are safe. And it's of course, it's a societal benefit. So we are living in democracies, and any misuse of data, it would be a crucial danger for any society. That's quite clear. So let's keep them safe. Let's try. So there are some administrative procedures around, and this is really a very fragmented landscape. So we have sometimes general admission procedure for biobanks. In Germany that doesn't exist. In Finland they have it. That's up to the jurisdiction in different countries. But very crucial is ethics committee approval. So I'm convinced you have the same here in Turkey, and I can tell you it might be very different from the German system, from the UK system, from the French system. That's a real mess. Let's say it as it is. So ethics committees are really very different around even Europe, and even within some countries, it's nobody knows exactly how that works. So you have your ethics committee at your university, and you deal with it, and you're lucky. But what if it comes to data exchange or multi-centered studies? Then the procedure of getting approval and to know whose approval you need at all. And that's really bad. So that's one of the working fields of BBMI, to try to standardize here a little bit, but this is really not easy. So just, it's not my core responsibility, but there are some discussions around, of course, intellectual property law. So who is the owner of research results, for example? And there are many discussions, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. You have your research department, you have your biobank, you have invested much money, effort, and time into the collection and quality assurance of the data and samples. So what about sharing data? Is there an obligation, an ethical obligation to share data so that we can make most use of it? Do we owe this to the donors to make the best use out of their data and samples and to give it to others? Or do we have the right or even the obligation to keep that secret for us, to use it for our own research purposes? Is competition better or is sharing better? So most policies and most funding agencies now require data sharing. But for example, there are some policies to monopolize the data just for 1 year. You give it to a database and it's blocked for 1 year, so that the home institute or the department can do their research, and after 1 year it's open for everybody to analyze it. That's discussion going on. And there's a BBMI activity around what's about credits for biobanks. It's also an open question. There's no clear system about it. And very crucial is to what extent do we want to commercialize research results. So there has been a huge debate about can we have patents on genes. So there's the famous breast cancer check, you know, that's the Angelina Jolie case, and so it's horribly expensive to get that test. And is that okay, or do we, is our genes, our genetic information, is it just open, is it just biology and just facts and accessible for everybody? But this is something that courts have to decide. I don't think that we can do anything here because there's a huge industry behind and they will go to court. But the question is still open, so we have several decisions around it. It's not completely clear. So just let me draw your attention to that question. So we are living in times of several attacks, and you know, the United States is very keen to search every database they can get. So there are really very different approaches. What is the state? What rights do states and maybe intelligence services, or I don't know, what rights do they have to search databases for research? So we have had the European Court of Justice has just given the red card to the United States and said, you know, transfer of data, of very sensitive data to the United States is not consistent with fundamental rights in the European Union. So we have this called safe harbor decision. So it has been before allowed to transfer data to the United States under a safe harbor scheme, so that with a requirement that the recipient just signs papers that these data are safe and so and so. And then all the revelations came out about the regular checking of all data, and then the European Court of Justice just stopped it. So for the EU, we have a really, let's say, strange situation. We are transferring these data, but nobody knows, is it legal or is it not? We cannot stop all research data exchange. That's impossible. So they are now negotiating. The governments and the European Commission tries to negotiate another safe harbor scheme to make further data exchange possible. But there you can see that even within the research community, there are sometimes really lines. So we are not so, we don't agree on everything.
Can I ask something?
Yeah, of course.
So what happens to the data when somebody decides to withdraw their material from the research? And the data obtained up to the withdrawal period, what's the legal framework for that?
So there is also a debate around in Europe. So my opinion on this is quite strict. You have to delete all personal data. All personal data. That means you don't have to, you cannot, and you don't have to extract data from research results or something. And this is not personal data. So what you publish, your research results are not personal data. So you have used it, and it stays in the research result. That's clear. But you don't have the right to further store and use the data for any other purpose. So you have to either very effectively anonymize it, and anonymization is a very crucial area. So that would fill a whole workshop. How can you anonymize? We are just planning a workshop on anonymization now in Berlin, and there many people have registered because it's really a crucial thing. So very effectively anonymizing would be one choice, but it's not possible under all jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions require that you have consent to anonymize due to the remaining risk of any anonymization, but you clearly have to delete all personal, all really identifying data. So it's withdrawal. That means you really destroy the legal basis for using these data and samples. So other questions, please. I'm coming to an end. I didn't want to bother you with many details. Some ethical questions, if this is of interest. So we don't have any legal basis for these questions. That's informing donors about research results. That has been a very interesting situation now in Estonia. So we have a colleague in Estonia, and they have a law that every donor has the right to get the full information about genetic analysis. The law is now 10 years old, and not one donor has got any information because they don't know what to feedback and how to feedback it. So they really want to do it, but they are still discussing how and what, because what do you do? Genetic analysis, I mean, what does it tell you as a patient or a donor? What information is relevant? Would you just print your whole genome and put it in an envelope and send it home, or what would you do? So they're really struggling with it. And then we have this incidental findings discussion around, and there you can ask, what is a finding, an incidental finding? What's the information behind, and is it useful? So these are really open and highly discussed questions, and we have no law at all to decide on this. And another really good question is around, if you have controlled access, what does that mean? Who gets access to data? With whom do you share? What is fair access? Do you have to belong to a university? Do you have to prove that you are a bona fide researcher? What's the basis for getting access to databases and biobanks? So we need guidelines on this. I don't have the answers. So let me just, it's even within jurisdictions, it's sometimes not easy to give answers. But when research is going global, when you want to have answers in the international context, so we need guidelines that are accepted in all participating countries or research infrastructures. So what we really must do is now come together within the research community and negotiate guidelines for everybody. So it's not only about lobbying for legislative harmonization, because outside the EU there is no legislative body. So we have, if we go global, we have to negotiate beyond the EU. Let's come together and develop guidelines and templates, consent templates, data transfer agreements, and all this. Because it makes it much easier if you act on the same basis. So informed consent management, and my colleague has pointed to it, is really a huge task. So you may have a sort of layered consent, you may have restrictions in consent forms, and then you have to go to your ethics committee and present maybe the consent form, and then you have a really fragmented system. And when you want to share data, it would be really helpful if everybody could rely on a similar consent, with some normal restrictions on that, so that you maybe can establish a system, just an electronic system to handle all these things. And any data or material transfer agreement has to reflect the consent. So this can be built on the consent forms. So it's really important not to develop a huge amount of documents, but to come together and agree on a certain set of documents that can be used by everybody. So that has to comply then with all the legal obligations, all the ethical principles. So we have really to start a debate on this. And it would be very good to have a really wide debate. So, no? It's not easy, so there should be an image. No. The images are lost. Takes some time. So just a few words to the Common Service Else we have at BBMI. So here you see that's the BBMI team. So we have experts, 21 experts from the member states, and it would be really a nice thing if somebody from Turkey could join. Just say, oh, I'm here, I would like to contribute, I would like to give my opinions. And we consist of lawyers, of social scientists, of philosophers and ethics people. And we try to build guidelines, information help desk, consent templates, and all these things. That's a huge task, and it would be really a good thing to achieve as wide as possible agreement among the research community to make life simpler for everybody, to reduce bureaucratic burden. So, jetzt. Okay, let's try. That's just a few team members. That's Anne Combon, the director of the Common Service LC, and there you can see, this is the Estonian colleague I've just told you. She presented these questions in a meeting, so that's why I know. That's Mats Hansen, for example. That's Heidi, that's Jasper Bovenberg. There you can see me, good teacher. So just to give you an impression that there are real people behind. That sometimes we build subgroups. So that's just an example. It's nothing special to just have this image there. Sometimes we build subgroups to really work on specific topics together. And we then meet in Graz and at the headquarters to develop some things. We had statements for European Data Protection Regulation. We did statements on the Council of Europe recommendation, very critical. That's about anonymization. The critical point is about anonymization. And wherever you like, you can just join. Say, I would like to come and discuss with you. So that's an invitation to you. Please, that's my request. Please keep in touch, and thank you very much.